The hospital lights buzzed softly through the quiet corridors of Meadow Ridge General as the late-night shift settled into its rhythm. Freya Langston adjusted her pink scrub top and glanced at the clock. 11:40. She exchanged a tired smile with Kiara Mendez, whose blue scrubs were a little rumpled after a long day in pediatrics. Nearby, Callie Huang, in her green emergency room uniform, was logging patient notes on a clipboard, her brow furrowed with concentration. These three had become more than just colleagues. They were a tightly woven trio, bonded by shared ambitions, long hours, and countless after-shift coffee runs. Each had carved her niche in the sprawling hospital. Freya's steady hands in dermatology and plastic surgery, Kiara's gentle care in the pediatric wing, and Callie's swift decisions in the ER. Tonight felt different, though. The hospital's usual hum seemed laced with an undercurrent of unease. Shadows stretched long down the hallways, and the faint scent of antiseptic mixed with the occasional distant beeping of monitors. Freya checked her phone. A message from her mother, Marcia, reminding her to stay safe and call before heading home. She smiled softly and typed back, "Will do, Ma." Hours slipped by. Nurses moved from room to room. Doctors conferred quietly, and the steady pulse of hospital life beat on. But when morning came, Freya, Kiara, and Callie were nowhere to be found. Marcia Langston's kitchen was bathed in soft morning light, but inside the air was thick with anxiety. She paced, phone pressed to her ear, her untouched coffee growing cold on the counter. 6 months, she whispered, voice trembling. 6 months without any word. On the other end, Isabel Mendez's voice was weary but steady. The whole neighborhood's been struggling, Marcia. The water problems started last night, and now this. Dr. Liwa Hang, joining the call from her clinic, added grimly, "Hospital admin called me at 4 about a major sewer blockage. Public Works has been trying to fix it all night." The three women, mothers bound by grief and hope, clung to each other, their lives forever altered by the disappearance of their daughters. Suddenly, Marcia's phone buzzed. Caller ID, Detective Vincent Rohr. Her heart leapt. "I have to take this," she whispered. The detective's news would soon shatter the fragile calm they'd been holding onto. Detective Rohr's voice was steady but urgent. "Mrs. Langston, there's been a significant development connected to the sewer blockage in your neighborhood. I need you and Mrs. Mendez and Dr. Hang to come to the Chandler Creek Industrial Park immediately." Marcia's knees weakened. What did you find?" "I can't explain everything over the phone. Please bring the others. I'm waiting at the sewer maintenance site." Within minutes, Marcia's friends were on their way. The trio, bound by a 6-month nightmare, raced toward the unknown, hearts pounding with equal parts hope and dread. The morning air was crisp as they arrived, the industrial park buzzing with police and public works crews gathered around a large excavation. Yellow crime scene tape cordoned off a freshly unearthed sewer pipe. Detective Rohr met them at the edge of the scene, his eyes gray. "Thank you for coming so quickly." He gestured toward the muddy ground where 3 sets of nurse scrubs lay spread out, one pink, one blue, one green. The fabric was caked with mud and stained dark. Marcia knelt, hands trembling as she reached for the pink scrubs, her daughter's signature pin still glinting faintly on the collar. "Freya's," she whispered. Isabel's fingers brushed the blue scrubs, tracing the butterfly patch Kiara had sewn herself. "It's hers," she said, voice breaking. Dr. Hang examined the green uniform carefully. "These are Callie's." The rubber grips on the shoes, she added those herself. For the ER's slippery floors, Detective Rohr nodded toward a forensic technician setting up equipment nearby. "We're conducting preliminary DNA tests here. This is our first solid lead in months." The mothers were led to a nearby police vehicle, their minds racing, hearts aching with hope and terror. Minutes felt like hours until the detective returned. The DNA match. These uniforms were discarded recently, definitely not in the sewer for the entire 6 months. A chill settled over them. This was no accident. Someone wanted to hide evidence or make sure it was found. Marcia's gaze hardened. "Who could do this to our daughter?" Before the detective could answer, a sleek silver BMW pulled up. A man in his early 40s stepped out, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. "Dr. Nathan Velman," Detective Rohr announced quietly. Marcia recognized him immediately, the respected surgeon who had supervised Freya. The pieces were starting to fit, but the truth was darker and more complicated than any of them imagined. The sterile hospital corridors hummed with a quiet urgency as night deepened. Freya, Kiara, and Callie moved through their rounds with practiced efficiency, the camaraderie between them a bright spot in the long hours. In the break room, Freya sipped her lukewarm coffee, her eyes weary but determined. "I can't believe the surgery scheduled tomorrow," she said, rubbing her temples. "It's going to be a marathon." Kiara chuckled softly. "You always say that and you power through like a champ." Callie grinned, flipping through patient chart. "We've got each other's backs, no matter what." Their laughter was light, a brief respite from the pressure, but beneath it, subtle tensions lingered. Freya's phone buzzed quietly with a message from her mother. "Call me when you get home." She glanced around and tucked the phone away. Later that night, after their shifts ended, the three nurses left the hospital together, chatting about weekend plans. It was the last time anyone saw them. When the nurses failed to check in or show up for work, colleagues grew concerned. The hospital administration launched a search, reaching out to families and local authorities. Marcia's phone rang relentlessly. "Freya, please answer," she whispered, heart sinking. At the station, officers took statements. Leads were scarce. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The families found solace in one another, forming a support network amid shared grief. 6 months later, the unexpected discovery in the sewer reignited hope and dread. Uniforms found wedged in a blocked pipe, stained and tangled. Detective Vincent Rohr stood with the mothers, the weight of the moment pressing down. "This changes everything," he said gravely. "We're finally getting closer." 6 months had passed since Freya, Kiara, and Callie had disappeared. For Marcia Langston, Isabel Mendez, and Liua Hang, each day felt like a cruel, repetitive echo. The weight of the unknown gnawed at them, a constant, unshakable presence in their lives. The grief that had initially been raw and overwhelming had begun to settle into a dull ache, a constant reminder that their daughters were still missing. Yet, with each passing day, the hope that they would find them alive, safe, had slowly become more fragile. The mothers clung to this hope like a thread, refusing to let it break. Even as the months stretched on, the media played its part, of course. The disappearance of 3 young nurses from a respected hospital was a story that captivated the community. News outlets reported on the case frequently, following every lead. Even as those leads grew colder, there were occasional updates. The discovery of a possible eyewitness who later recanted their statement, an unverified tip from a supposed insider at the hospital, rumors swirling about the nurses' social media profiles being hacked before their disappearance. But no substantial information ever surfaced. Every press conference, every interview, and every news segment only seemed to underline the frustration and pain of the families. The mothers had become regulars in front of cameras, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and determination. But no matter how many interviews they gave or how many people offered their condolences, the silence from their daughters was deafening. The media attention was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it kept the case alive in the public eye. On the other, it subjected the mothers to constant scrutiny. Reporters speculated about everything: the nurses' personal lives, their relationships with their colleagues, and even potential secret love affairs. Every detail of their lives was put under the microscope. For Marcia, Isabel, and Liua, it was a suffocating pressure. The 3 mothers found comfort in each other's company, their shared grief forming a bond so strong it became unbreakable. Every day, one or more of them would check in, making sure the others were coping. They had formed a new family in the absence of their daughters, finding strength in their mutual determination to find answers. They began to rely on each other more than they had before. Their conversations, once full of updates on their daughter's progress at the hospital, or talk about weekend plans, had shifted. Now they spoke of their daughter's absence with aching tenderness, retelling stories of how their girls used to laugh at the same jokes, how they used to complain about hospital bureaucracy, or share their dreams for the future. The memories had become both a balm and a wound, a reminder of what had been lost, but also a beacon of hope that they would someday find the answers they so desperately needed. Liua, who had always been the pragmatic one, found herself tearfully holding the hands of the others more often. Isabel, who had been more reserved, began to express her pain more openly, and Marcia, the most vocal in her search, found that the pain of not knowing had hollowed out parts of her. The friendships formed between them were now more important than ever. They had become not just grieving mothers, but a united front. Each text message, each phone call, and every face-to-face meeting became a lifeline. They were no longer just friends. They were a family, bound together by love and law. As the weeks dragged on, a different, unexpected problem began to emerge in the community. The water and sewer systems in the Milh Haven neighborhood, already aging and prone to issues, began to fail on a more frequent basis. It started with minor complaints, discolored water, low water pressure, but soon escalated. Families reported brown sludge coming from their taps, showers were unusable, and washing machines turned dirty clothes into even dirtier ones. Liuai's clinic was one of the first places to be affected. As a medical professional, she understood the implications of an unreliable water supply. Without clean water, sterilization of equipment was compromised, and the health risks became undeniable. Her patients began to cancel appointments, and she had to reschedule critical surgery. The ripple effect of the water issues spread quickly, impacting every corner of the community. The problem was quickly recognized by the local authorities, and public works teams scrambled to address the issue. Large trucks and teams of workers appeared in neighborhoods, digging up streets and pipes, trying to track down the source of the contamination. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that this was no ordinary problem. The issue was much bigger, far-reaching, and more complicated than initially anticipated. Then, one morning, the unthinkable happened. The local public works team discovered something strange while clearing a drainage pipe near Chandler Creek, a section of the city notorious for its old infrastructure. They had been working for days, dealing with persistent blockages that had caused the ongoing water contamination. But what they found inside the pipe sent shockwaves through the entire team. Bundles of fabric, caked with mud and debris, were wedged tightly in the drainage system. As workers carefully removed the obstruction, they realized that the bundles were no ordinary garbage. Upon closer inspection, they revealed a set of hospital scrubs, pink, blue and green. The workers immediately called the police. What they had found was both unexpected and deeply disturbing. The uniforms were unmistakably those worn by hospital staff, a revelation that sent a chill through the investigation. The connection between the sewer problem and the nurse's disappearance suddenly became clear. The workers had unknowingly stumbled upon the missing link in the case. Someone, or something, had placed these uniforms in the pipe. The deliberate nature of the act, the way the uniforms were bundled and shoved into the pipe, suggested it was not a random incident. It was an act of concealment, an attempt to hide some. Detective Rohr was immediately contacted, and within hours the scene was cordoned off by police. Forensics teams arrived on site, collecting the uniforms as evidence. But one crucial question remained. Was this a clue that would lead them to the missing nurses, or was it something more sinister? The morning after the uniforms were discovered in the drainage pipe, the scene at Chandler Creek was buzzing with activity. Forensics teams were swarming the area, photographing every angle, collecting mud samples, and marking off the location with precision. The yellow crime scene tape snapped in the wind, as investigators worked quickly to secure the uniforms and any surrounding evidence that could tie the scene to the missing nurses. Back at the station, Detective Vincent Rohr sat in his cramped office, reviewing the photographs of the sewer blockage. The uniforms, pink, blue and green, were carefully placed in evidence bags. There was something eerily deliberate about how they had been shoved into the pipe. The methodical placement suggested that whoever had done this was not only trying to conceal evidence, but possibly wanted it to be discovered. The thought of someone intentionally staging this scene gnawed at Rohr. He glanced over at his desk, where the evidence report sat, ready for review. It included initial notes from the forensic team about the uniforms, caked with mud, stained with something that appeared to be blood, and most ominously bound tightly together with wire and surgical tape. The crime scene technician had noted that this wasn't just a haphazard disposal of clothing. It was a calculated effort to block the sewer system and make the uniforms heavy enough to remain stuck. Detective Rohr picked up the phone, dialing the forensic lab. "Yes, I need a full DNA analysis on the uniforms. We need to know if there's any blood or tissue, and fingerprint testing. Run them through the database. We need a match quickly." The urgency in his voice was clear. He had no idea where this break in the case would lead, but one thing was certain. It was the first solid lead in months. The DNA and fingerprint results came back within a few days, though Rohr couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his stomach as he waited. He knew the uniforms belonged to the missing nurses, but until he had the lab results, everything was still uncertain. He stared at the forensic reports, his heart beating faster with every line. The first result confirmed his suspicion. The blood on the uniforms did indeed match human DNA, but it wasn't just any DNA. The forensic team had managed to isolate enough to cross-reference the missing persons report. It was a match for the missing nurses, Freya Langston, Kiara Mendez, and Kali Huang. But the uniforms weren't the only piece of evidence under scrutiny. The fingerprints on the wire and surgical tape used to bundle the scrubs were also tested. "Got something," the forensic analyst reported to Rohr later that day. "The wire was wrapped tightly around the uniforms, and there are prints on it. We ran them through the system." Rohr leaned forward, his heart racing. "What did you find?" "A match, a name you might be familiar with. Marcus Deaks. The name hit Roar like a punch to the gut. Marcus Deaks was a known criminal, with a violent history. A man who had escaped capture after a string of armed robberies and other felonies. Deaks had been linked to low-level criminal activity in Milh Haven for years, but he had always managed to stay under the radar. The significance of the uniforms, and now the fingerprints, was clear. The case had gone from a missing persons investigation to something far darker. It wasn't just that someone had stolen the nurses away. It was that someone, possibly someone they knew, had actively been involved in hiding the evidence, trying to make sure they stayed lost. And now, with the discovery of Deaks's fingerprints, it seemed that the case was beginning to point in a terrifying direction. Roar's mind raced as he thought about the larger implications. If Deaks was involved, then the entire case might involve more than just a random kidnapping. Was Deaks working alone, or had he been hired? And if he had been hired, who was the mastermind behind the plot? The discovery of the uniforms, coupled with Deaks's involvement, pointed to a well-orchestrated plan, but who had the means and the motive to orchestrate such a scheme? As the investigation deepened, two characters emerged from the shadows of the case. Nathan Velman, a well-respected plastic surgeon who had worked closely with Freya in the dermatology department, quickly became a person of interest. Dr. Velman was known for his calm demeanor, his meticulous work in the operating room, and his close relationship with his patients, particularly Freya. The two had worked together for years, and rumors had swirled about a professional friendship that had occasionally flirted with something more. But Dr. Velman, with his cool professional exterior, was well liked by colleagues and patients alike. No one had ever suspected him of being involved in anything untoward. But now, with Deaks's name emerging as a key player, Velman's presence in the investigation became all the more unsettling. Could the trusted doctor be involved? And if so, why? Marcus Deaks, on the other hand, was an enigma, a career criminal with a rap sheet longer than most. Deaks had been linked to several robberies in Milh Haven, but he had always managed to evade capture. Known for his violent temper and unpredictable nature, Deaks had been on the run for years, but now, his fingerprints on the wire that bound the uniforms to the sewer pipe made him a prime suspect in the nurse's disappearance. As Roar dug deeper into Deaks's background, a chilling connection began to surface. Deaks had been seen in the area near the hospital just days before the nurse's van, and what's more, he had a history with the local criminal underground, involving a network of people who might have had access to information about the nurses. As the investigation began to narrow its focus, the mothers of the missing nurses became more involved than ever. Marcia, Isabel and Liwa made regular trips to the police station, demanding updates, offering new information, and pushing for answers. The toll that the months of waiting had taken on the women was visible in their eyes, their faces drawn with exhaustion, their hearts heavy with fear and grief. But despite the strain, they refused to back down. They were mothers, after all, and they would stop at nothing to find out what had happened to their daughters. In one particularly tense meeting with Detective Roar, Marcia's voice cracked as she spoke. "Detective, you have to understand, Freya, my daughter, was always so careful. She was so determined to make something of herself. She wasn't the type of person who would just vanish without a trace. Someone took her. Someone took all of them." Isabel, her face pale with worry, nodded. "Kiara, she would never leave without telling me where she was going. We've been through everything, every lead. There's nothing. We need to know what happened." Liwa's voice was the calmest, but the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. "My daughter, Kaylee. She was never afraid. She could handle anything. But this is beyond anything we could have imagined." Detective Roar met their gazes, his own exhaustion apparent. He knew the weight of their words. "We're getting closer, I promise you." The days that followed were filled with growing suspicion. Dr. Velman, once a trusted colleague and friend to Freya, was now a person of interest, and while Roar had no direct evidence linking him to the nurse's disappearance, the circumstantial evidence was damning. The rumors surrounding Velman's relationship with Freya took on a darker tone, and the detective couldn't ignore the possibility that the doctor might have had more than just a professional connection with her. Was it possible that his involvement went beyond the medical field? Was he hiding something more than just his connection to the nurses? And then there was Deaks. As Roar dug into his past, a pattern began to emerge. It seemed that Deaks had been involved with the criminal underworld in Milh Haven for years. He had connections to people who had access to the hospital, to the staff, to the administration. Could it be that someone had used Deaks to get rid of the nurses, knowing that he could do the dirty work? The case was starting to unravel, and as it did, the mothers felt the weight of it all. They had trusted people, colleagues, doctors, even friends, and now they were forced to question everything. Every detail, every interaction was suspect. The walls they had once built around their lives were crumbling, and the truth was slowly starting to emerge. Piece by piece, the breakthrough came when Detective Rohr pieced together the evidence and decided to focus on an abandoned clinic located on the outskirts of Milh Haven, a place that had remained dormant for years. The clinic had once been owned by Dr. Velman's father before it closed down due to poor business. Now, it was little more than an old, decrepit building, shrouded by overgrown vegetation and long forgotten by the town. The police had already linked Marcus Deaks to this location, but the idea that the nurses might be hidden there was still speculative. Rohr knew they couldn't afford to act on just a hunch. They needed concrete evidence. This was their last chance to find out what had happened to Freya, Kiara and Callie. As night fell over Milh Haven, Rohr, along with a team of officers, set up a stakeout around the clinic. Tactical units were deployed, and surveillance cameras were installed on surrounding buildings to monitor activity. Every officer knew the stakes. The lives of 3 young women were on the line. From a nearby van, Rohr monitored the feed on a bank of screens. The moonlight barely touched the rundown clinic, making it blend seamlessly into the shadows. Rohr's fingers drummed anxiously on the console as his eyes darted from one screen to the next. They had no way of knowing exactly what they would find inside, but they couldn't afford to let Deaks slip through their fingers again. A few hours into the stakeout, an unmarked black motorcycle appeared, rolling up to the back entrance of the clinic. The rider's face was obscured by a helmet, but there was something chillingly familiar about the way he maneuvered his bike. "That's the same motorcycle from earlier," Marcia whispered to herself, having been briefed on the surveillance and staying at a nearby location for updates. Rohr, who was watching the live feed from the van, leaned closer. "That's our guy, Marcus Deaks." The motorcycle parked near the clinic's back door, and the rider disappeared inside, his presence confirming Rohr's suspicions. He signaled to his team. This was it. The arrest had to happen now. Rohr wasted no time. The tactical team, which had been waiting for this exact moment, moved swiftly into position. Officers in plain clothes discreetly approached the front of the clinic, while the tactical team prepared to breach the back. "Move in," Rohr said, his voice sharp and steady. The officers moved with practiced precision, surrounding the clinic's perimeter. They had no idea what they were walking into, but they had prepared for every possibility, from Deaks being alone, to the potential of a violent standoff. The team had done their homework. Deaks had a history of violence, and there was a sense of urgency in the air. Rohr knew that this was a rescue mission. They couldn't risk a delay. They needed to secure the area quickly. As the officers closed in on the back door, the front team moved to the clinic's main entrance, weapons drawn and voices low. "Police, step out with your hands up." The scene inside was grim. Deaks had not been alone. Rohr and his team discovered him along with another man, Dr. Nathan Velman. The moment they breached the door, they found what they had feared. Freya, Kiara and Callie were there. All 3 of them, locked away in a filthy isolation room. They were emaciated, their bodies weak from months of malnutrition and physical neglect. Their once vibrant eyes now hollow, their faces gaunt and covered in dirt. Freya, who had always been the strongest of the 3, was sitting upright on a small makeshift cot. She looked up as the officers entered, her eyes clouded with confusion, but as the door slammed open, recognition flashed across her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Mom," Freya croaked, her voice breaking as tears welled up in her eyes. Marcia, who had been standing just outside the building, ran toward the door, her heart pounding. When she saw her daughter, her knees nearly buckled under the weight of the sight. "Freya, oh my God," she sobbed, rushing into the room and cradling her daughter in her arms. Kiara and Callie, though equally frail, were still alive, still breathing. They were huddled together in a corner of the room, and they too looked up in disbelief as the police stormed the area. "Mom," Kiara whispered, as if the word itself was foreign on her lips. Callie, barely able to stand, looked over at Liwa, who had just entered the room. "I'm sorry, Mom," she muttered, her voice trembling. "I tried to hold on, but Liwa, her face filled with relief, knelt beside her daughter. "You're safe now. You're safe, sweetheart." The 2 men were swiftly arrested, Dr. Nathan Velman and Marcus Deaks. Velman was handcuffed without protest, though his face was unreadable. He had no defense, no way to justify the horrors he had inflicted on these women. Deaks, on the other hand, struggled as officers pulled him to the ground, his anger apparent as he spat and cursed. Rohr stood over the 2 men as they were led away. "This is far from over," he muttered under his breath. There were still questions to be answered, but for now, They had the most important piece. The nurses were alive. Once the nurses were removed from the clinic, the medical teams immediately took charge. They were rushed to the nearest hospital, where an entire team of doctors was on standby, ready to provide immediate care. The physical toll was staggering. The nurses were dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from untreated infections. But even in their weakened state, their resilience shone through. Freya, despite her frailty, insisted on seeing her mother first. Kiara, ever the optimist, clung to hope. And Callie, though visibly shaken, had a fire in her eyes that told her everything would be okay. Doctors immediately placed them on intravenous fluids, starting with high-dose rehydration and vital nutrient infusion. They were given specialized care for their emotional trauma, and hospital psychologists were brought in to help with their psychological recovery. The nurses remained in the hospital for weeks. They had lost significant muscle mass and would need physical therapy to regain strength. Freya, who had always been so focused on her career, struggled to accept that it would take time to recover. But with her family and friends around her, she began to heal. The hospital staff worked tirelessly to help them regain their strength, both physically and mentally. Dr. Li Wahan, with her medical background, was instrumental in ensuring the proper care and support was given to her daughter, Callie. Liwa insisted on being present for every meeting with the doctors, ensuring that Callie had the best possible care. Similarly, Isabel stayed close to Kiara, reassuring her that her pain would eventually ease. The emotional reunions between the nurses and their families were tearful and overwhelming. Marcia, Liwa, and Isabel spent countless hours at the hospital, their lives forever changed. But amid the pain, there was also overwhelming relief. Their daughters were alive. They were coming home. Freya, Kiara, and Callie leaned on their families more than ever. They weren't just recovering from physical trauma. They were also healing emotionally, supported by the love and dedication of their mothers and the extended families who had stood by them. There were many difficult days ahead, but the worst was over. In the days following their release from the hospital, each of the nurses took small but important steps toward rebuilding their lives. They were enrolled in counseling, and their family members attended sessions with them to help with their emotional recovery. They had seen unimaginable horrors, but they were alive, and together, they would reclaim their futures. After the dramatic rescue of the nurses from the abandoned clinic, the investigation shifted into high gear. The focus was now entirely on Dr. Nathan Velman, the trusted and well-respected plastic surgeon who had once been seen as a mentor to Freya. The truth that emerged about his involvement in the abductions sent shockwaves through the community, shattering the illusion of his impeccable reputation. The investigation revealed a chilling pattern of deceit and misconduct that stretched back for years. Dr. Velman had been falsifying patient records, inflating insurance claims, and performing unnecessary surgeries to line his pocket. His private practice had been in deep financial trouble, despite his outward success. Loans taken to establish the clinic had piled up, and his fraudulent practices had allowed him to keep the business afloat for far longer than it should have. But the deeper the detectives dug, the darker the story became. Dr. Velman had been aware that Freya, Kiara, and Callie were investigating his shady practices. Freya had begun to notice discrepancies in patient records, and the nurses had discussed reporting him to hospital administrator. Velman had panicked. His financial future, his medical career, and his reputation were on the line. Instead of facing the consequences, he resorted to desperate measures. He had hired Marcus Deaks to silence the three women, arranging for their abduction and ultimately imprisoning them in the isolated clinic. Rower and his team pieced together the events leading to the nurses' disappearance. Velman had been aware of their suspicions, and in a twisted act of self-preservation, he hired Deaks to kidnap them, ensuring they would be kept out of the way. His plan was to keep them hidden until he could find a way to handle the situation. The discovery of Velman's financial and professional misconduct added a layer of motive to the case. His fraudulent insurance claims had been a major part of his income, and the potential of losing everything drove him to make the unthinkable decision to have the nurses kidnapped. Deaks had been promised a large sum of money in exchange for his services, and Velman had believed that keeping the women hidden would solve all his problems. But the situation unraveled quickly. As Velman's own personal and professional life started to crumble, his desperation grew. When Deaks failed to carry out the original plan of eliminating the nurses entirely, Velman's panic only deepened. He had intended for them to disappear forever, but as time wore on, he realized that the longer they were kept hidden, the more dangerous it became for both him and Deaks. During the interrogation, Velman confessed in a cold, detached manner. His voice lacked the remorse one might expect from a man who had caused so much pain. He described how he had meticulously planned the nurses' abduction, how he had kept them confined in the clinic, and how at first he had convinced himself it was the only way to protect his career. "I had no choice," Velman had said, his words barely above a whisper. "They were going to ruin everything I worked for. I didn't want to hurt them, but I had to stop them from speaking out." The interrogation of Marcus Deaks was even more revealing. Unlike Velman, Deaks didn't hide behind a veneer of respectability. He was volatile, angry, and unable to maintain control when faced with his crimes. Deaks admitted to kidnapping the nurses but claimed that he had never intended for them to suffer for so long. He explained that his initial orders were to scare them into silence, not to keep them captive for months. When asked about his involvement with Velman, Deaks became agitated. "The doctor promised me a new life, a new face," he spat, referring to the facial reconstruction surgery he had been trying to get from Velman. But he kept stalling. He kept making excuses. "I thought if I just kept the nurses hidden he'd do what I wanted. But he did. He just lied and lied." Deaks's confessions made it clear that while he was the one who had physically held the nurses hostage, Velman was the mastermind behind the whole operation. Deaks had been motivated by the promise of a fresh identity, something that had been tantalizingly close yet always just out of reach. But in the end, it was the financial desperation of Dr. Velman that had led to the nurses' captivity. With the confessions in hand, the legal process began to unfold. The police worked tirelessly to build a case against both Velman and Deaks, compiling evidence from their interrogations, the nurses' testimony, and the financial records that linked Velman to the fraud. The charges against both men were severe: kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, medical malpractice, and a series of lesser charges related to their criminal activities. The community was in shock. Dr. Velman had been a respected figure in Milh Haven for years. He was well liked by patients and colleagues, and no one had suspected that the man who had been trusted with so many lives could be capable of such horrors. His fall from grace was swift, but the impact on the community was devastating. As news of the arrest spread, the hospital staff was torn. Some were in disbelief, unable to reconcile the image of the dedicated, professional surgeon they had worked with for years with the man who had orchestrated such a horrific crime. Others were furious, both at Velman and at themselves for not seeing the signs sooner. Velman's trial was highly publicized, and the courtroom was filled with reporters eager to cover the story. The families of the three nurses sat together in the front row, their hearts heavy as the details of the abduction came to light. The mothers' faces were a mixture of anger and disbelief as they listened to the charges against the man they had once trusted. As the days passed, the legal proceedings moved forward. Velman and Deaks were both held without bail, and their trials were scheduled to begin several months later. The prosecution had a strong case, with overwhelming evidence from the confessions and the physical evidence recovered from the abandoned clinic. Velman's medical license was revoked immediately, and he faced multiple lawsuits from patients who had been harmed by his fraudulent practices. The legal teams began preparing for what would be a long and difficult trial. The mothers of the missing nurses worked closely with the prosecution to ensure that the trial would provide the answers they had been searching for. They would not let Velman and Deaks go unpunished. The media's coverage of the case only intensified as the trial date approached. The nurses' story had captivated the public's attention, and now they would finally have the opportunity to hear the full details in court. News outlets aired interviews with the families, and reports were published daily, detailing the nurses' struggle and the shocking revelations about Velman's involvement. In Milh Haven, the community was left reeling. People struggled to understand how someone they had trusted for so long could betray them in such a profound way. The case became a symbol of how appearances could be deceiving, and how even the most respectable people could hide dark secrets. But amid the media frenzy, there was also a sense of relief. The nurses were alive, and they were finally going to get justice. The long, agonizing months of uncertainty had come to an end, and now the families could begin to rebuild their lives. The road to healing would not be easy. Freya, Kiara, and Callie were physically recovering, but emotionally, the scars would take much longer to heal. The nurses received extensive therapy to help them cope with the trauma they had experienced. They met regularly with psychologists, who worked with them to process the emotional and psychological wounds of their captivity. Freya, once the most determined of the group, found herself struggling with nightmares and moments of panic. She had always prided herself on her strength, but now she had to learn to lean on others for support. Kiara, the optimist, tried to keep her spirits high, but even her bright smile couldn't mask the sadness that lingered behind her eyes. She worked hard in therapy, focusing on her future and how she could use her experience to help others who had suffered similar trauma. Keely, who had always been independent, found herself feeling vulnerable in ways she hadn't anticipated. The isolation of the clinic had affected her deep, but with the love and support of her family, she was slowly learning how to trust again. As the nurses worked through their trauma, they also received unwavering support from their families. Marcia, Lewa, and Isabel remained by their daughters' sides, providing constant love and encouragement. The bond between the mothers and their daughters grew even stronger as they navigated the difficult journey of healing together. The hospital provided ongoing counseling services, and the nurses began to reconnect with their colleagues. Though the experience had irrevocably changed them, they still had moments of fear, anxiety, and uncertainty, but they were determined to rebuild their lives. Months later, as the nurses continued their recovery, the mothers took stock of how far they had come. Marcia, once consumed by the pain of not knowing, had learned to live with a new reality, one where her daughter was home, alive, but forever altered by what had happened. Isabel, too, had come to terms with the long road ahead. The joy of having Kiara back was tempered by the pain of knowing how much she had endured. Lewa, ever the pragmatist, had begun to focus on the future, determined to help Callie recover and find new strength. Together, the families had forged a new path forward, and though the memories of what they had lost would always linger, they knew that the love they shared would carry them through. The case was far from over, but the worst was behind them. The long and painful journey of Marcia, Lewa, Isabel, and their daughters had finally reached its most pivotal moment. The months of agony, uncertainty, and waiting had ultimately led to a reunion, but the emotional scars of what had happened could never fully be erased. They had seen the worst of humanity in the darkness of the abandoned clinic, but they had also witnessed the best of human resilience, the power of love, strength, and unyielding hope. Freya, Kiara, and Callie had fought to survive. They had fought not just for their lives but for their future. And now, as they continued to heal, they were surrounded by the unwavering support of their families and the people who loved them. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the most important thing was that they were no longer trapped in the past. They had made it through the storm, and now, they could look toward rebuilding their lives, one day at a time. The trial of Dr. Velman and Marcus Deaks was just the beginning. The legal proceedings would take time, but the truth had been unveiled. They had exposed the lies, the manipulation, and the cruelty that had kept the nurses in captivity. And now, the world knew the truth about what had happened to them, but the community was still reeling from the shock. Milh Haven would never be the same. Trust had been shattered, and lives had been forever altered. Yet, the one thing that remained unbroken was the courage of the families. They had withstood the darkest days and emerged stronger. They were no longer defined by what had been taken from them, but by the strength they had found within themselves. Freya, Kiara, and Callie's story was one of survival, of enduring the unimaginable and finding the will to fight back. But it was also a story of hope, of the power of love and family to heal the deepest wounds. Their journey wasn't just about surviving the horrors they had faced. It was about reclaiming their future, their voice, and their identity. As the nurses continued to recover, both physically and emotionally, they began to rebuild their careers, their relationships, and their sense of self. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were no longer victims of their circumstance. They were survivors, empowered by their strength, their courage, and their ability to rise above the darkest chapter of their lives. For Marcia, Lewa, and Isabel, the journey was far from over. The memories of their daughter's suffering would never fade, but they had learned to live with the knowledge that they had done everything in their power to bring them home. The pain would always be a part of them, but it would not define them. And as for the community of Milh Haven, they would carry the lessons of this tragedy with them for years to come. The story of Freya, Kiara, and Callie would never be forgotten. It would be a reminder of the darkness that can exist in the world, but also a testament to the power of the human spirit to overcome it. But the journey does not end here. This story is a reminder that we must remain vigilant, compassionate, and active in our community. The abuse of power and manipulation happens every day, in every community, in every corner of the world. We must not turn a blind eye to injustice, and we must continue to support those who are voiceless and vulnerable. If you or someone you know is facing any form of abuse, neglect, or mistreatment, it's never too late to speak out. Seek help. Speak up. Your voice matters, There are resources available, from hotlines to counseling services, to support you on your journey toward healing. We must also stand together in solidarity with those who have suffered at the hands of abusers, holding perpetrators accountable and ensuring justice is served. By doing so, we honor the strength of the survivors and pave the way for a safer, more just future. As the nurses continue their recovery, we call on you to be part of their journey. Stand with the survivors, share their stories, make sure that the truth never fades away. Let this story of courage, survival, and hope remind us all that even in the darkest moments, we have the power to bring about change. If you found this story moving, please share it with others. Let the voices of the survivors be heard. Join the movement to fight against abuse, support survivors, and hold perpetrators accountable. Together we can make a difference. Stay connected, share the story, be a part of the change.